It's a cold winter night in Washington, D.C. Richard Nixon is lost in thought, pondering over what to do. The Vietnam War is taking its toll on the nation. The younger generations are protesting whilst getting high on marijuana and LSD, and soldiers are coming back with amphetamine and opioid addictions from government-supplied battle drugs. It's starting to become clear that the war is not working out, but Nixon knows he can't just pull out without losing face. America needs to come together and set aside their differences to focus on one goal. America needs a new enemy. Disclaimer: I do not endorse drug use in any way. This video is made for informational and educational purposes. Notice, my view on this topic is biased, and there is also some speculation in this story. With soaring war expenses and with a count of human life lost that is unjustifiable by any means, another battlefield is the last thing the United States need on their hands. Nixon looks out the window, still contemplating his options, when all of a sudden it hits him. Drugs. Stoned youngsters and addicted veterans would be his political weapons against the nation's new #1 enemy. He found the red lining, and with it he forms a master plan that would leave the country crippled for decades to come. Alright, let's backtrack a little here. Even though a lot of the harsh drug policies origin from this decision, there were already measures in place beforehand to regulate certain substances. In 1909, the smoking of opium became illegal. In 1914, the Harrison Act was passed regulating opiates and cocaine, and 5 years later, in 1919, the sale and production of alcohol was prohibited. This prohibition lasted for over a decade until it was repealed in 1933. A couple of years later, in 1937, the Marijuana Tax Act was passed, putting taxes on cannabis and hemp with hefty penalties for those that wouldn't pay. 1 year later, a German scientist named Albert Hofmann stumbled upon a highly potent psychedelic substance, LSD. In the 2 decades that followed, research into psychedelic drugs and their potential medical use resulted in thousands of studies being done. In the mid-1960s, however, funding for these studies came to a halt, and then everything changed when Richard Nixon declared the war on drugs in 1971, accompanied by the execution of the Controlled Substance Act that was passed in 1970. But this was only the beginning, a small ball of snow rolling down from the top of a very large mountain. 2 years later, in 1973, Nelson Rockefeller passed the Rockefeller drug laws in New York, which had 15-year mandatory prison sentences. Carrying a little over 100 grams of narcotics had just become as punishable as second-degree murder. In 1975, the Vietnam War had ended, returning home many soldiers with debilitating addictions caused by drug supplies of the United States government. Between 1966 and 1969, over 200 million amphetamine tablets had been consumed. A year later, a daring California scientist by the name of Alexander Shulgin started experimenting with MDMA. The following year, he recommended the substance to a psychiatrist friend, igniting a fire that would fuel thousands of MDMA-assisted psychotherapy sessions. Even though he wasn't the first person to synthesize the substance, which was done in 1912, he had found an easier way to make it and became known as the godfather of MDMA. In 1981, the first reports of crack use were appearing. Up till that point, cocaine had been sold in its powder form, but overproduction and underconsumption had incentivized producers to come up with a new strategy that would allow for easy distribution to a larger audience. The result was crack cocaine. The next year, President Ronald Reagan doubled down on Nixon's effort, once again declaring a war on drugs. In the years that followed, drug laws were reinforced and expanded, until eventually in 1986 the Anti-Drug Abuse Act was passed, which set mandatory prison sentences for certain drug-related offenses. The ramifications of this law were more than just anti-drug though, as there were different penalties set for the use of crack cocaine and powder cocaine, which were ultimately the same substance. Crack cocaine, which had been running rampant through poor neighborhoods of mostly black and Latino citizens, was condemned heavily, whilst the use of the more expensive powder cocaine by the white population was largely ignored. The fact that they were using cocaine at the same rate didn't seem to matter. In 1987, the Drug Policy Foundation was founded by Arnold Trebach and Kevin Zeese. Their mission was to form a loyal opposition to the war on drugs. In 1994, the Linda Smith Foundation formed, which was conducting research related to drug reform. When the new millennium dawned in the year 2000, these two foundations merged together and became the Drug Policy Alliance. At this point, the number of people incarcerated for non-violent drug offenses had increased to over 400,000 compared to the 50,000 in 1980. 2 years later, in the year 2002, research into psychedelic drugs slowly starts to pick up again. Even though marijuana, psilocybin, LSD, and MDMA are still classified as Schedule I drugs, the most prohibited class, a paradigm shift is slowly starting to take place. In the decade and a half that follow, research is being done into MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD patients, LSD-assisted therapy to alleviate existential dread for terminally ill patients, ayahuasca-assisted therapy to combat drug addiction, and much more. During this time period, the public view on recreational drug use is also changing, and more people are starting to demand freedom in altering their state of consciousness. Cannabis gets especially much attention, and in 2012, Colorado and Washington, D.C. become the first two states to legalize the plant. Now, almost 6 years later, in 2018, many states are starting to follow suit, and with the help of the internet and media, people are becoming more aware of the potential upsides of certain drugs. A tree of knowledge is starting to sprout that is no longer able to be suppressed. But what has this all left us with? And how do we continue from here? One thing we can be sure it hasn't left us with is a strategy that produces results. Since the war on drugs started, between $800 billion and $1.5 trillion have been spent on it. During this time period, the addiction rate has barely changed. It's clear that mass prosecution and incarceration isn't the answer. The thing is that drugs will find a way into society no matter what. By making drugs illegal, we only stimulate the growth of drug cartels. This in turn will result into more violence, higher prices, and stronger drugs. Often violence and addiction are arguments that are used to substantiate the war on drugs, but in reality the war itself is a leading cause for these factors. The same thing goes for drug safety. By making drugs illegal and their possession punishable, it's impossible to regulate their production. Combine this with the inability to test our drugs and we have a recipe for disaster. Basically, the producers can mix their products with any variety of compounds, barring it isn't something completely different to begin with. Taking a drug that turns out to be something else or that is cut up with another substance is very dangerous and has led to many fatalities. By being able to test your drugs and having regulated sales, many of these deaths can be prevented. Luckily, we can order test kits online nowadays, but we still have a long way to go. Another major issue is that of mass incarceration. Even though the United States only has about 5% of the world's population, they host about 25% of the world's prisoners, with a staggering 2.2 million people locked up. In 2016, almost half of the federal prisoners were prosecuted for drug-related offenses. Instead of locking these people up, we should use this money to reintegrate them in society, give them help if necessary, and turn them into productive citizens that contribute to the greater good. At the moment, there are still people serving sentences related to cannabis use in states where cannabis has since been legalized. Just think about that for a moment. Unfortunately, incarceration itself isn't just the issue, but also the racial division between inmates. Black people make up half of the prisoners for drug-related convictions. This was also the main issue with the crack cocaine situation. Black neighborhoods that lived in poverty were more likely to use the much cheaper crack cocaine over the more expensive powder cocaine. Instead of coming together as a society and helping them, these people were vilified and received heavy punishments. It's clear that this was no accident, and the political climate over the years has demonstrated this time and time again. For example, in 1992, Bill Clinton was advocating for drug treatment programs during his presidential campaign. But after a few months of being in the White House, he returned to the harsh prosecution of drug use, even rejecting a proposal to lift the divide between crack cocaine and powder cocaine. The same goes for Nelson Rockefeller, who was a proponent of drug rehabilitation, seeing it as a social problem, until he completely changed his stance by supporting the Rockefeller drug laws. Needless to say, this happened during a period where there was a lot of upheaval about drug use, and this would strengthen his political positions. But probably the clearest example comes from John Ehrlichman, who was an assistant to Richard Nixon. In an interview he said, You want to know what this was really all about? Nixon had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to either be against the war or black, but by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and black with heroin and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. Did we know we were lying about the drugs? Of course we did. This quote goes to show just how politically incentivized this whole war on drugs actually is. But with our vision aimed at the future, we have to look at the possibilities and opportunities to create not a drug-free world, but a drug-balanced world. A world in which the veterans that have fought in a drug-fueled war get treated for PTSD with MDMA-assisted therapy. A world in which drug addicts get treated with compassion and perhaps receiving ayahuasca therapy on the side. And most importantly, a world in which we all have the right to control our own minds and alter our state of consciousness. For freedom of thought is our ultimate freedom. That's it for this video. We had a look at some of the key moments and motivations in the war on drugs. I realize that I've only covered the United States, and even though I am Dutch myself and fully well realize that drug laws vary greatly across the world, I think the United States has a major impact on the rest of the Western world and also holds some of the most draconian views on drug use. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed this content, join the pack by subscribing down below. And most importantly, stay safe.